Thank you, everyone, for being here. Today is the fifth anniversary of the Supreme Court decision that put a for sale sign on our elections. 5 years ago, the Supreme Court gave us Citizens United. That was when things went from bad to worse. Since then, they've also given us the McCutcheon decision. Now one person can give $3.6 million directly to campaigns and parties. The voices of ordinary citizens are being overwhelmed by big money. The court is following a precedent from 1976, Buckley versus Vallejo, when it first ruled that money and speech are the same thing. But we are here today because Americans know that the court got it wrong. Money and politics are out of control. The elections last year tell the story. Over $1 billion was spent from billionaires and special interests. Much of that money was hidden. And to give you an example, in the top Senate races this cycle, over half the money was not fully disclosed. The result was that on Election Day, we knew who won, but we didn't know who the supporters were. Our founders never intended this, for billionaires to be able to influence elections by writing checks with no limits. And the American people are absolutely fed up. Congress needs to act to put elections back in the hands of voters. Today, we are reintroducing a package of comprehensive reforms, and you'll hear from many of the members who have supported these reforms over the years. There's no doubt we have a broken system. I believe the best way to fix it is to amend the Constitution, overturn bad decisions, and prevent future ones. Congress should have the power to regulate campaign finance at the federal level, and states should have the power to do that at the state level. Amending the Constitution will take time, but we can implement other reforms in the meantime. We must shine a light on all of this money, at the least to say where the money is coming from. And we must pass public financing measures to empower small donors. The American people want change. They want a government that works and gets things done. Our election should be about the quality of our ideas, not the size of our bank accounts. We can't hand our democracy over to the people with the biggest checkbooks. So I'm very pleased to be here with my colleagues, and the first one who will speak after me will be Senator Sanders, who's always been a champion on election and campaign finance reform. Bernie?
Well, let me thank Senator Udall and Public Citizen, People for the American Way, and all the many, many organizations all over this country who are united in saying that democracy is not for sale, that we cannot allow a handful of very wealthy people to buy elections. One of the great concerns, I think, that many Americans have is that we have the most unequal distribution of wealth and income of any major country on earth. And that's a serious problem. It's a serious problem that the top one-tenth of 1% own more wealth than the bottom 90%. But what's even worse is that as a result of Citizens United, those billionaires and multimillionaires are now able to buy American democracy. Some of you may have seen an article that appeared in the Washington Post not so long ago. And the point that the article made is that the Koch brothers alone have or soon will have a political database stronger than the Republican Party. So when you look at political forces in America, increasingly, it's not going to be the Democrats and the Republicans. It's going to be the Koch brothers and other billionaire political forces that are organizing from the state level all the way up into the White House. Now, the American people are not much into political process. What the American people say is, how do we create an economy that works for all people? How do we raise the minimum wage? How do we have health care for all of our people? How do we deal with climate change and many other important issues? But if anybody thinks that the issues of the economy, minimum wage, overtime, job creation, climate change, education are not directly related to campaign finance reform, you are terribly wrong. Overwhelmingly, the American people say, raise the minimum wage to a living wage. Our Republican colleagues refuse to do that. Why is that? It's because those folks who profit from low wages do not want to see it happen. The American people say, rein in Wall Street. Don't hold us accountable and have to bail out speculation on the part of Wall Street. And yet right now what's going on in the House is important Dodd-Frank provisions are being repealed. Why is that? Does it have anything to do with the fact that Wall Street is pouring huge amounts of money into the political process? I think it does. So if we are concerned about restoring the middle class in this country, making sure that people have decent wages, and the environmental crisis of climate change, where the energy companies are putting so much money into the political process, we have got to overturn Citizens United, which in my view will go down in history as one of the worst Supreme Court decisions ever. And furthermore, we have got to move toward public funding of elections. So I just want to congratulate all of my colleagues and the millions of people who are demanding that billionaires not be able to buy American democracy. Let's go forward together. Thanks.
I tried to keep a list here of it, so I'm not going to do more introductions, but I'm just going to give you the list as people showed up. We'll proceed with Senator Tester, Senator Whitehouse, David Price, Ted, Chris, and Sarbanes. Go ahead.
Well, I just want to thank everybody for being here. I want to thank my fellow folks that serve in Congress behind me today. Our democracy is at risk. That's really the bottom line. The democracy that has worked so very, very well for the last couple hundred years plus is at risk. Why? Because of the huge amounts of dark money that are going into our campaigns. It really puts, as Bernie said, the power in the hands of very few wealthy people. I know this firsthand. I ran a election that was pre-Citizens United in '06 and one that was post in 2012. According to OpenSecrets.org, outside spending increased nearly 600% between those two races, from 4 million to over 25 million. The story about dark money goes a long ways. The fact is that it does not make the electorate better informed, less informed. I lost those fingers when I was 9 years old in 1965. During the election, one of the dark money folks felt like, because of a picture that I had with President Obama, that it would be better, more encompassing if they put those fingers back on. And so they ran ads with me having 10 fingers, which I was tickled about because I was hoping to wake up the next morning and be able to go left on the basketball court. It did not happen. The fact is there was no accountability whatsoever for making an incredibly intentional error. And until we overturn Citizens United and make our elections more transparent, we can expect more of that. And it's one of the reasons I introduced the SUN Act, which will require dark money groups to disclose their donors if they give more than $5,000 to a nonprofit who's trying to influence elections. That way, we all know who's trying to buy the vote. If we do not rein in these abuses, if we do not pass legislation to get big money out of elections, if we don't give regular folks a chance to have a say again, the democracy as we know it will not continue to exist. So it's important for both Democrats and Republicans that we make the changes that we're going to talk about here today. And I think it will happen only with the people in this country rising up and saying enough. And I'm telling you, it's enough. With that, I will turn the stage over to Senator Whitehouse.
Thank you. And I'm going to ask my colleague Chris Van Hollen to join me, since he is the initial sponsor of the Disclose Act. 5 years ago, the Supreme Court issued one of its most reprehensible decisions in a long history of a Supreme Court that has from time to time engaged in reprehensible decisions. But this is the disgraceful decision of the modern era. It has unleashed what one Kentucky newspaper called a tsunami of slime into our elections that has turned regular voters away from politics enhancing the control of the special interests who'd like to see regular voters disinterested in politics. Worse, although the judges themselves acknowledged that disclosure of who was behind these ads was necessary for democracy to work, what we have seen is that disclosure has been torn apart in the intervening 5 years. Much of it has been dark money spending. Much of it has been for so-called issue ads, which needn't be reported. Well, there's a simple solution to this, and that's our Disclose Act. This bill, which I'm reintroducing today in the Senate, would require political groups to disclose their big donors so that voters can know whose voice is behind the ads. Right now, you can be the most nefarious and unpopular political actor in the world, and you can launder your identity until you come across to the voters as Rhode Islanders for puppies and prosperity. And it's a lie, and we've got to straighten it out. Used to be a bipartisan idea. Majority Leader McConnell once said, virtually everybody in the Senate is in favor of enhanced disclosure, greater disclosure. That's really hardly a controversial subject. Or at least it was hardly a controversial subject until the big dark money interests wanted to protect their role and their secrecy. So let me close with a key point that I think we all need to bear in mind as we focus on the problems that Citizens United has caused. When you give big corporations and billionaires the power to spend millions and millions of dollars, unlimited money in elections, and when you give them the power to do it secretly, you don't just give them the power to do those things. You give them the power to threaten or promise to do those things. And those threats and promises will never be public and will never meet the standard that Citizens United purported to set for disclosure. So I'm grateful to have more than 24 Democratic co-sponsors of the Disclose Act, and I'm grateful to Congressman Van Hollen for leading this effort in the House. Chris.
Thank you. Thank you, Sheldon, and thank you, Senator Udall, and all of our colleagues that are gathered here today on the 5-year anniversary of which was a very dark day in American democracy, which allowed very powerful special interests to commandeer our democracy in a way that they hadn't before. There are lots of things we need to do to roll this back, but one thing we can do, as Senator Whitehouse indicated, is something that 8 of the 9 Supreme Court justices in Citizens United said we should do and was essential to American democracy, and that is transparency. In fact, if you read the Citizens United decision, it's as if the justices expected that all of this financial giving and spending would be disclosed to the public. A naive point of view, given the political process, but that is what they said in that opinion. And that is an opinion that is shared by 80% of the American public, Democrats, Republicans, and independents. And that's because it's based on a very simple but powerful idea, which is voters have a right to know who is spending millions and millions of dollars to try and influence their vote. And what we see is more and more money flowing underground, secret money pouring into these elections. The secret is between those who are spending the money and the American public. I can tell you it's not a secret between the people who are spending the money and the people who are benefiting from those expenditures. The people who are being left in the dark are the American public. And that's why we need to pass the Disclose Act today to get this job done. And I'm really pleased to team up with Senator Whitehouse. We will be introducing the Disclose Act in the House today. My colleagues here from the House are co-sponsors, and we're going to be pushing this. And my last plea to those who are in the press, but also those who talk a lot to the press. A lot is written about this issue in editorials, in articles, but what they're not communicating to the American people is that there are actually solutions that are being put forward here in Congress to address this, right? You have a whole litany of the problem of money and secret money in American politics, but little mention of the fact that here in Congress, we've got some proposals to try and address that. If you want to hold politicians accountable, you need to tell the public that there are things in Congress that we can do about it. And I'm just going to end by quoting somebody who I agree strongly with. And that was somebody who said, why would a little disclosure be better than a lot of disclosure? Senator Mitch McConnell in 2002. I agree with Mitch McConnell in 2002. Here's another statement. We ought to have full disclosure. John Boehner, Congressman Boehner, now Speaker Boehner, in 2007. And here's another statement. The best way, the fairest way, is greater transparency. Let people understand where the money is going and what's happening. Congressman Kevin McCarthy, 2010, now the Republican whip in the House. So you have the three most powerful Republican leaders in the United States Congress on the public record in favor of disclosure. So let's point out to them again and to the public that that's what they said. We're all giving them an opportunity to do what they said that we should do to maintain the health of American democracy. We need to raise the decibel level on this issue to help protect our democracy. And I thank my colleague Sheldon Whitehouse and all my colleagues that are part of this. Thank you.
These days, campaign reformers, among whom I've numbered myself for a number of years, are forced to play defense as well as offense in order to confront new, insidious, damaging attacks on the pragmatic campaign laws adopted over the years in Washington. When I was first joining this effort over a decade ago, I was defending presidential public financing, a system that had grown outdated and had prompted calls for repeal. I'm proud to continue to lead that chorus of our colleagues in favor of mending, not ending, our system of presidential public financing, which by any measure has been a very successful post-Watergate reform effort. As congressional races have become more expensive and dominated by big money, I and others have expanded our efforts to include congressional public financing. And we've put into a proposal that we'll be very shortly introducing, a congressional public financing proposal consistent with the proposed reforms to the presidential structure. And then after this deeply misguided Citizens United decision has unleashed an avalanche of outside spending in our elections, our efforts have evolved once again, as you've heard here this morning. And in particular, this time, we need to ensure that super PACs and so-called social welfare organizations play by a fair set of rules. In fact, the set of rules that the Supreme Court has assumed they play by. So today, in addition to co-sponsoring the Disclose Act, I'm introducing the Empowering Citizens Act with my good friend Chris Van Hollen. This important legislation would stem the growing influence of individual candidate super PACs. Should be a contradiction in terms. Individual candidate super PACs, which are dedicated to the election of a single candidate, and it would do that by restricting their affiliation with campaigns. Close affiliation between candidates and these outside groups has allowed campaigns effectively to skirt all donation caps. The supposed independence of these groups has become a bad joke. The Empowering Citizens Act would also restrict the ability of individual candidate super PACs to share B-roll and other resources with campaigns. These are especially egregious versions of the violation of our campaign finance laws, the spirit and the letter. Our bill is not a total solution, but we designed it to be both credible and realistic. The damage done by Citizens United and related decisions can only be undone by a more favorable Supreme Court or a constitutional amendment. But Congress can and should make progress on targeted reforms in the meantime, and enhanced disclosure and accountability for so-called independent groups is an important and achievable target. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you very much. In January 2010, when the Supreme Court issued Citizens United, I was in the midst of my first run for Congress. And I promised my constituents that if elected, I would introduce a constitutional amendment to get big money out of politics. When I got here, I was heartened to meet so many other lawmakers who are committed to this cause, many of them here today. I especially want to thank Senator Udall and Senator Sanders for leading the constitutional amendment fight in the Senate, and for everyone here who is so committed to restoring integrity to our election system. Today we stand united. We stand united behind the Democracy for All amendment, an amendment to reclaim what the Supreme Court took away 5 years ago, the people's right to pass laws protecting the integrity of our elections. We stand united with a coalition of more than 126 advocacy organizations, 16 states, and most importantly, over 5 million Americans who have endorsed amending the Constitution to reverse Citizens United. And we stand united with the American people. There may be no Republicans here today, I acknowledge that. But only in Washington is getting money out of politics a partisan issue. Poll after poll shows that Americans of all political stripes are disgusted by the ever-growing influence of special interests in Washington. Outside of this town, this is not a partisan issue in the least. Sad truth is that for most Americans, their influence in our government has shrunk each time the Supreme Court has invited more money into our elections. We're introducing the Democracy for All amendment today and a range of legislative solutions that you've heard about to restore their voice. Why? Because seniors living on Social Security don't have their own super PACs, and low-income children aren't among the tiny sliver of mega millionaires who hit the aggregate limits struck down by McCutcheon. Both Citizens United and McCutcheon have proven to us that the 5-4 majority on the Supreme Court responsible for those decisions lives in an alternative universe where corporations and mega millionaires have a First Amendment right to buy unlimited influence in Washington. These decisions have stripped away the legitimacy of campaign finance laws, so the only ones left are the ones barring quid pro quo bribes between politicians and donors. Well, it may not be quid pro quo corruption, but when elected officials spend more time dodging super PAC attack ads than championing their constituents' interests, our democracy is dysfunctional, and dysfunction itself is a form of corruption. America was founded on the principle that we're all political equals. The ballot of a billionaire is worth no more than that of a school teacher. Laws that limit the influence of money in politics disenfranchise no one. They empower everyone. They ensure that every American has an equal say in our democracy. These solutions call for the type of better politics that President Obama spoke of last night. And they also reflect our belief that the American people can't afford a pay-to-play democracy, nor should they have to. Free speech is not free if only the wealthy can afford it. This is going to be a long battle, but it's one worth fighting, and it's one that the people ultimately will win. We look forward to waging that fight together, and I appreciate the opportunity to be here. Thanks.
Well, I'm delighted to be here with my colleagues, all of us fighting back against the influence of big money. We're fighting here, but we're really fighting on behalf of millions of Americans who've decided they've had enough, as so many of the members have said here today. Abraham Lincoln famously said in the Gettysburg Address that the world will little note and no long remember the words said here today. When he said that, of course, a few passages later, he spoke words that are indelibly etched in the minds of generations of Americans. He said, "We highly resolve that government of the people, by the people, and for the people shall not perish from the earth." 5 years ago, in the Citizens United decision and decisions subsequent to that, this Supreme Court hastened us down a path towards government of, by, and for special interests and big money, not for the people. And we need to do something about that. Millions of Americans are coming together in a movement to take their country back from the special interests. They want their voices to be heard. They're desperate for that. And as I think Chris Van Hollen said, too often the problem is spoken of without pointing to the solution. There are people here in Washington, you see them here today, who believe we can make a difference on behalf of the American people. And we understand that we're the instrument of millions of Americans who are fed up and want to fight back. Today, with 138 original co-sponsors, we are reintroducing in the House of Representatives the Government by the People Act, H.R. 20. which would create a small donor matching system, publicly financed, to fund congressional campaigns. This is critical because right now, if you want to raise money for your campaign as a candidate or a member of Congress, there's only one place for you to go. You have to go to the PACs. You have to go to the special interests. You have to go to the big money donors. That's the only way you can raise the money you need to wage a competitive campaign. If we could create another place for candidates to go, if that were a place where millions of Americans could make small donations and earn public matching funds, you would see members in this chamber, in these chambers, turn in an instant to that source of funding their campaigns and turn away from the PACs and the big money donors and the well-connected and the wealthy. And in turning to the people, they would be creating a different kind of dependence. Not a dependence on big money that ends up calling the shots on an insider's game, but dependence, as James Madison said, on the people alone. That's the promise of small donor reform, which is embraced, and Chris mentioned this, and Ted mentioned it, embraced by Americans of all political stripes. Republicans, independents, Democrats support this kind of reform because they understand that it will give them their government back. Now, when Abraham Lincoln talked about not having a government of, by, and for the people perish from the earth, he was signaling us, he was conveying the idea that democracy, our form of government, is a perishable commodity. When you look at the fact that we had the lowest turnout since 1942 in a national election because so many people don't believe their voice counts anymore, then you understand that our democracy is in peril. When you look at the billions of dollars that poured in from dark money sources in the last campaign cycle, that created this sort of wave over the American people, you understand that democracy is in peril. So we have to nurture what is a perishable commodity, our democracy, government of, by, and for the people. That's what all of the measures here are designed to do. They all work together on behalf of giving a voice to the American people. This is going to happen. There is a movement out there. And I believe, and I know we believe, that 300 million Americans are more powerful than two brothers named Koch and powerful industries out there. We can fight back. And when we do, we will restore a government of, by, and for the people. Thank you all for coming today, and thanks for all your help.
Happy to take some questions from the press. Yeah.
Senator, I don't know, maybe it's a tough question to ask, but Democrats are in the minority in the House and Senate now. That's the reality. These are all proposals that were introduced when Democrats had the majority in at least the Senate, and you weren't able to pass them really to get much traction. What is there a strategy for getting these even considered on the floor in the Senate? Would you offer them as amendments, or what can you do realistically to advance these proposals?
Yeah, well, first of all, we do have a much more open amendment process, and Senator McConnell, our new majority leader, has said he wants to have an open amendment process. So I think you may well see various amendments on campaign finance reform offered. But the other thing that I think, and others may want to step forward on this, the other point is that over the years, many of these proposals have been bipartisan. And that reflects what is out there in the public, just as Congressman Sarbanes said. I mean, people, this isn't a Democrat and Republican issue with the public. This is get the money out of politics, get this under control. I would just point out on my constitutional amendment, and this is building support, and I expect Republicans to join us. 4 years ago, we had 4 co-sponsors. This last Congress, we had 49, and we got 55 votes on the Senate floor for the constitutional amendment. So we have moved a long way in a very short period of time. I picked this constitutional amendment because in 1983 it was introduced by a Republican, by Ted Stevens. And over the course of time, 11 different Republicans have either been co-sponsors or been on the amendment. And so you can see there is a thread of bipartisanship here, and I think part of this is going to get the American people organized in such a way that they influence all of their elected leaders, Democrats and Republicans, to step forward on this. I don't know if others want to jump in on that.
I would just add, as I said before, Senator, when more than 5 million people have already signed a petition, when 150 organizations and their millions of members around the country are already on record supporting these efforts, what you realize is that the focus on what happens in Washington often prevents us from what's actually happening in America. And in America, people are tired of the influence of money in politics, and they want the Congress to do something about it.
I'll just pick up on what Ted said. We're celebrating 50 years since Selma and the march from Selma to Montgomery. Back then, if you'd asked people who'd introduced civil rights legislation leading up to 1965, what the prospects of being able to get that passed would be, they would have acknowledged, as we're acknowledging, that it's very difficult. But what happened is eventually the dam broke. And we're talking about, as we've all said, there's a movement out in the country to take the country back, take government back from special interests. That can't be denied. So we're going to keep working on this. We're going to propose these measures, but we know that there's really an army of people out there that stand behind us. They don't stand behind us. We stand in front of them. Let's put it that way. We are trying to be their instrument here. And that's what's going to make the difference. And the key is, will we be ready when the moment of opportunity presents itself? And a coalition like the one that has come together around these important reform measures, and the people in this room represent that coalition, this coalition is going to be ready when that opportunity presents, and we'll take advantage of it at that time.
Congressman Capuano, you want to jump in?
Nope, I have an expectation you guys have said everything that's necessary. Plus more.
You can jump in on the fate. Go ahead.
Yeah, you can take tough
On the
questions.
question.
Given the Republican leadership in Congress and the fate of this bill in the last Congress, did you ever consider a different approach, or scaling it down, or changing the bill in some way and going after those areas that might potentially reach bipartisan?
Well, I've always been willing to work with any Republican. I've approached all the 11 on the constitutional amendment that have either been co-sponsors. Only 2 are left, Senator McCain and Senator Cochran. And we're in a constant dialogue. And we hope that the army that's out there of citizens in their states that want this to happen get in touch with them and talk to them about this amendment and these other reforms. There were many quotes here about disclosure by Republicans before they were leaders. All of these issues have a real bipartisan theme, and we just need to tap into that with the groups. With the groups that are represented here, I mean, there's an old labor saying, early to bed, early to rise, get out and organize, and then get out and organize. And that's really the phase we're in here. I think the proposals are solid. We just need the American people to let their elected leaders know that they want the big money out of politics.
Let me just say, if you look at the array of proposals being discussed here today, you'll see precisely the kind of a distinction you're describing. And with respect to super PACs and so-called social welfare groups in particular, we're acknowledging the total solution would likely involve a reconstituted Supreme Court or a constitutional amendment. But in the meantime, there are 2 achievable targeted reforms that we believe have the potential to move without the total solution being achieved. One of them has to do with disclosure, which has had wide support from the Supreme Court all through the Republican Party and is clearly called for. And then secondly, the rules of affiliation. to make independent groups, make sure independent groups are in fact independent. That's a less tested proposition, but I'm very hopeful that having experienced some of the abuses, that we can get a wide swath of our colleagues to acknowledge the need for that.
Go ahead.
I have no idea whether anyone will wake up and smell the coffee, but anybody who's spent 2 minutes on the street anywhere in America has heard the same thing I've heard. People don't trust us. They all think we're in somebody else's pocket. And there's a reason for that. It's because of what's going on right now. So much money is in so many campaigns, you can't figure out where it's coming from. The average person just gives up, and I don't blame them. All this is an attempt to simply shine a little light so people have a better idea who we raise our money from, how the money gets spent to elect their representatives. It's really not that difficult, and any one of these alone is a good step towards that. As a package, it's even better. So any member that might have a problem with any one specific aspect, fine, don't sign on to that bill, or come up with an amendment. Well, I'm happy to work with them. I'm sure we all are, to get something done for the very simple reason. I just want America to trust us just this much more. Just this much more. And I think that's what this is really all about. I mean, again, I can't pretend we're all going to be pure and wonderful little Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts the day after this passes. But America just doesn't think that we hear them, and they think that the money is between us and them. Sometimes they're right, sometimes they're wrong, but I just want them to be a little bit more understanding of who is talking to them. That's really all it's all about. I think it's very simple.
Let's take one more question, and then we have one. Well, looks like we're okay. Thank you all very much. Thanks a lot.
Great to see you. Thanks very much.
Thanks a lot.